The King family legacy is one that changed the course of history for Black people in America. It extends well beyond Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s untimely passing in 1968. It is a legacy that is marked by the pursuit of civil justice and peace in the nation. Unfortunately, the King family legacy is also tainted by wrongful deaths. 6 years after the assassination of one of the world's most esteemed leaders, Dr. King, his mother, Alberta Williams King, would suffer the same fate, dying at the hands of a gunman. The tragic incident led the world to wonder why anyone would seek to harm a family who has already experienced so much sorrow. Some would say the answer is religion, others, misguided anger. This is the untold true story of the assassination of Alberta Williams King and the Black Hebrew Israelite who took her life. Mrs. Alberta Williams King was born in 1903 in Atlanta, Georgia. She was the daughter of Jenny Celeste and Reverend A.D. Williams, the second pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. The upstanding values her parents instilled in her, principles that she would pass down to her children, are the foundation for the historic legacy created by her second-born, Martin Luther King Jr. Mrs. King's life was deeply rooted in her faith and activism. Her father, husband, and both of her sons were all ministers at Ebenezer, where she played an integral role until she retired in 1972. The King matriarch would often return to lead the church in song. Ironically, Ebenezer Baptist Church, just a few blocks away from where her son Martin was buried 6 years prior, was where Mrs. Alberta Williams King took her last breath. Her death was classified as an assassination. The man who carried out the heinous act was 23-year-old Marcus Wayne CHENAULT. Born on June 30th, 1951 in Winchester, Kentucky, Marcus Wayne was described as a quiet child who read a lot. He was raised by his parents Marcus H. and Hinda Lee CHENAULT. They were God-fearing and lived comfortably. That was until they moved to Dayton, Ohio, when Marcus, often called Wayne by his family, was a teenager. Hinda Lee, who was deeply religious, recalled to Washington Post. Up until 1967, he seemed to enjoy the church, but later he became a bit confused and started asking questions about different things in the Bible. As a student in high school, CHENAULT excelled academically. A school officer at Dayton Roth High School told Jet magazine, "He just went from homeroom to class. I never had any trouble with him. He was as good as gold." In 1969, Marcus was accepted into Ohio State University, and it was during his college matriculation that his demeanor began to change. Although he was still described as quiet and studious by his professors and peers, it was during this time that he began to reassess his traditional Christian values. Leon Vaughn, one of CHENAULT's Ohio State classmates, told Jet magazine, "Marcus was a really beautiful cat. He interpreted things to me like the Bible and the Star of David. The main thing he would say is that religion isn't for real because people couldn't be charged for the truth. He resented preachers riding around in Cadillacs. He said that parts of the New Testament were false and that King James stole literature from blacks and didn't give them any credit. He said King James was a Caucasian who based his interpretations on America's standards." His newfound religious ideals came from the teachings of his mentor, Hananiah Israel of Cincinnati. Hananiah, a spiritual teacher whose legal name is Stephen Hallman, spread messages from what he called a form of Judaism. CHENAULT met Hananiah about 8 months before the incident after seeing his advertisement titled, "What Every Negro Should Know About Scripture," in a magazine. Israel began instructing him in the Bible during meetings in which CHENAULT took lots of notes and often invited friends. Hananiah criticized black civil rights activists and church leaders as evil and deceptive. In his teachings, he wrote, "When you stop those lying preachers from deceiving you and your loved ones, from robbing them of millions of dollars a year, you will have a better economy." He also taught that black civil rights leaders were leading black people to doom. He told Dayton Daily News, "White men are being used by the Most High as a correcting rod, but God is going to do away with white people and free my people. When black people are freed, they will be the masters and whites will be the slaves. Until then, blacks should remain slaves to white men because that is the role God has assigned to them." Although Israelites insisted that he did not advocate for violence, he taught that only the death of black ministers would free black people. He told Dayton Daily, "I gave Marcus the key to understanding the scriptures. He awakened from the death of sleep, from the grave of ignorance." Hananiah and Marcus, along with other young men who followed his teachings, were labeled by some as Black Hebrew Israelites, a religion of black people who believe that they are the descendants of the ancient Israelites. They incorporate teachings from various sources, including certain aspects of Christianity and Judaism, and have created their own interpretation of the Bible. They are not associated with the mainstream Jewish community nor mainstream Christianity. CHENAULT and Israel assert that they did not belong to any organized group or following. Although Marcus Wayne recruited a number of young men from Ohio State and the surrounding areas to begin following his teachings, other classmates thought his religious talk was off-putting. We always thought he was a little weird, but there were a lot of weirdos on campus, Carol Peters told New York Times. She recalled having lunch with CHENAULT on occasion, but eventually began to avoid him. She said that he would get high and talk about the Bible at parties, and a party was no place to talk about the Bible, but he did, and people were turned off by it. By his junior year, Marcus dropped out of college and began to focus on religion. He adapted a head honcho persona. His neighbors took note of the change, accompanied by him shouting obscenities and Muhammad Ali type rhymes out of his apartment window while blasting soul music. He wrote General CHENAULT with 4 stars on his mailbox and Servant Jacob on his apartment door. His antics led him to being arrested for disorderly conduct, which seemed to have pleased him. CHENAULT's neighbor, Richard Keish, recalled as a group of people who gathered for the spectacle that CHENAULT came out with his hands up saying things like, "No comment," putting his hands on the car to be searched even though no one asked him to. Keish also shared with Jet magazine that CHENAULT told him that he would soon be all over the newspapers and that he was going to Atlanta to meet destiny. On Friday, June 28, 1974, Marcus Wayne CHENAULT returned home for what seemed to be a routine visit. According to Marcus Sr., Wayne seemed as normal as ever. That night, Marcus stole 2 pistols from his father's bedroom. The next day, he bought a bus ticket to Atlanta, Georgia. After a 12-hour trip, Wayne had made it to his destination, where according to a taxicab driver's testimony, he was picked up from the bus station and asked to be taken to Ebenezer Baptist Church. On the way, he asked the driver if Mr. and Mrs. King attended the church every Sunday. Later that morning, after being picked up from a motel, Marcus was taken back to the church. He was invited to attend men's Bible study. Marcus introduced himself and said he was from Ohio. According to witness testimony, once the service began, he was seen sitting in the Amen corner of the pews, which is normally reserved for the most devout worshipers. Mrs. King finished playing the Lord's Prayer on the organ, and as the congregation bowed their heads in prayer, they heard Marcus shout, "I'm taking over here this morning." They looked up to find him standing on the pew holding a gun. His first shot struck Mrs. King in the head and she fell over the organ. "It seemed like I was watching a scene from a bad movie play out," Christine King Ferris, Alberta's daughter, would recall in her 2009 memoir, Through It All. Marcus fired every round in his gun. He stood over Mrs. King and shot her again. He shot a deacon, Edward Boykin, and a church member, Jimmy Mitchell. Mrs. King's grandson, Derek, who said he helped to subdue the gunman as he tried to reload a pistol, told The Guardian. "He was delirious. He said over and over, 'The war did this to me. It's the war.'" As Marcus fled, the sanctuary was in chaos. Christine described, "There were people everywhere. There was a throng of onlookers. When I looked in their eyes, I saw what is often described as the 1,000-yard stare. It was a kind of blankness I'd never seen before." Mrs. King was taken to the nearby Grady Memorial Hospital, where officials say she was barely alive on arrival. The King family arrived at the hospital shortly after to learn the unfortunate news that Dean Edward Boykin and Mama King had passed away. CHENAULT was arrested and taken to the same hospital as his victims to be examined before being taken to jail. He and Reverend King crossed paths and exchanged words. King told Jet magazine, "There wasn't much conversation between us, but I did ask him why did he do this. He answered by saying that all Christians were his enemy." CHENAULT had another revealing encounter that day with Reverend Ralph D. Abernathy, president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Reverend Abernathy just so happened to be visiting the Atlanta chapter president, Hosea Williams, in the Fulton County Jail. From a cell nearby Hosea's, CHENAULT called to Reverend Abernathy and said, "If you want to live, you had better get rid of that Reverend in front of your name." Inside CHENAULT's Columbus apartment, officials found a list of 10 names that he intended to kill. Along with Reverend Abernathy, Aretha Franklin, and civil rights leader Jesse Jackson were among the names on what he called the death list. According to the New York Times, police also found an unused bus ticket to Chicago where Jesse Jackson lived. Written on the ticket was, "Father's Day Massacre Canceled." On July 9, 1974, Marcus Wayne CHENAULT was indicted by a Fulton County grand jury for the murders of Mrs. Alberta King and Deacon Edward Boykin, for aggravated assault for the shooting of Mrs. Jimmy Mitchell, for carrying a pistol without a license, and for carrying a concealed weapon. Marcus was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death by electric chair. Dr. Lloyd T. Backus, director of the Law and Psychiatric Service for Grady Hospital, examined Marcus for 7 hours. He was determined to have schizophrenia and declared insane at the time of the murders. Although it was said not to have affected his ability to decipher right from wrong, Dr. Backus' testimony was that Marcus suffered from delusions of grandiosity. His sentence was reduced to life in prison, partially due to the King family opposing the death sentence. Upon hearing the news that Marcus was responsible for the death of Mrs. King, the CHENAULT family was in disbelief. His sister Nancy told Jet magazine the only explanation for Wayne's actions was that he went berserk. "We have every record that Dr. King has. We loved him, the whole family." Hinda Lee, Wayne's mother, who was in such a state of shock that she had to be sedated, told Washington Post, "I know I didn't raise him this way. He was a good boy and we never had any problems with any of the kids." Some black public figures spoke out about a conspiracy regarding Mrs. King's death. Angry about the lack of seriousness regarding assassinations in the US, Jesse Jackson told Jet magazine, "They seem to be too strategic and coming too regular to be the work of lone berserk gunmen." Dick Gregory shared his thoughts on the matter with Jet magazine. He said, "If anybody can believe that a cat can go berserk in Dayton, Ohio and get on a bus with 2 guns and don't shoot nobody until he gets to Atlanta in church, then they're crazy. Do you realize how much aim and how much practice one must have to be able to hit somebody in the head 3 times with a handgun? It's just totally unbelievable. And so I definitely don't rule conspiracy out." It's the same pattern with Sirhan, Lee Harvey Oswald, and James Earl Ray, that every time one of those persons was arrested, they went to his house and found a diary with some other stuff in it. Now they go to CHENAULT's house and find a diary with 10 other people's names in it. See, it's the same pattern that is followed. A spokesman for the Atlanta Police Department Homicide Division issued a statement in which he said there was no evidence indicating a conspiracy. Thousands gathered in Sisters Chapel at Spelman College for Mrs. King's memorial service. Many shared similar sentiments of virtue. Dr. Benjamin E. Mays of Morehouse College said, "Love God and love your fellow man. If these are the requirements of God, Alberta Williams King met them from the beginning. Her life was a brilliant example of Christian living. Why do good people have to die at the hands of wicked men? Somehow, it must be in the plan of God." Mrs. Alberta Williams King led by example. In the words of Dr. Julius S. Scott of Spelman College, "We looked at her and we saw all our imperfections. It was the foundation of her faith that enabled her assassin to take a bus from Ohio to Georgia and not have to sit in the back." Marcus Wayne CHENAULT died of a stroke in prison in 1995. He was 44 years old. Stay up to date with the latest news and comedy by subscribing here to our YouTube channel, follow Comedy Hype across all social media, and look out for original content on our new streaming service at comedyhype.com. For Comedy Hype News, I'm Ramil Thompson.